A veteran struggling to stay upright pushed through the pain with every step toward Buckingham Palace. His medals shone, each one a symbol of courage and sacrifice. The royal guard stood firm, eyes locked on him, unmoving. But when the veteran's legs finally gave out, everything changed. In that moment, protocol was broken, and what happened next brought the entire crowd to a silent standstill. Here's how it unfolded. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Now, let's get into it. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace like a shroud, carrying with it the weight of history and the whispered prayers of countless souls who had walked these very stones before. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and London was slowly stirring to life, unaware that within the next hour, two men would share a moment that would remind the world what true honor really means. Corporal John Miller had been standing at his post for exactly 43 minutes. His black boots, polished to mirror perfection, reflected the pale morning light as he maintained the rigid posture that had become second nature to him over the past 3 years of service with the Queen's Guard. The weight of his bearskin hat, the stiffness of his red tunic, the cold metal of his rifle, all of it had become extensions of his own body, part of a living statue that tourists would photograph and children would marvel at. But beneath that motionless exterior, Miller's mind was anything but still. His eyes, trained never to move, had already catalogued every face in the growing crowd, every unusual movement, every potential threat. It was a skill honed not just in the ceremonial duties of palace guard, but in the dusty compounds of Afghanistan, where the ability to read a situation in milliseconds meant the difference between coming home and becoming another name on a memorial wall. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now stood guard over a palace while his brothers in arms were still out there, still fighting, still dying. Some nights, when the London fog rolled in thick and heavy, it reminded him of the smoke that would rise from the villages outside Camp Bastion, and he would find himself gripping his rifle a little tighter, his jaw clenching involuntarily as memories threatened to surface. It was then that Captain Daniel Hayes appeared at the edge of Miller's peripheral vision, though, of course, Miller couldn't turn to look directly at him. Hayes moved with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who had learned to negotiate with pain on a daily basis. Each step was a calculated decision, a small victory, one against a body that had been broken and rebuilt more times than he cared to count. The medals on Hayes's chest caught the morning light with every labored step forward. The Distinguished Service Order, the Military Cross, the Afghanistan Campaign. Medal. Each one a story, each one a memory, both treasured and haunted. He had polished them the night before, as he did every Sunday morning before his weekly pilgrimage to this place. Not because he sought recognition or sympathy, but because these small pieces of metal represented the men who hadn't made it home, and they deserved to shine. Hayes had been making this journey for 8 months now, ever since his physical therapy had progressed to the point where he could walk the 3 miles from his flat in Pimlico to the palace gates. His wife, Margaret, had initially protested, worried about his legs, worried about his pride, worried about what would happen if he fell. But Hayes had been insistent. "I need to do this, love," he had told her. And something in his voice had made her understand that this wasn't about stubbornness or machismo. It was about survival. The blast that had changed everything had happened on a Tuesday morning much like this one. Hayes had been leading a patrol through a village in Helmand province when the world exploded around him. The first IED had taken out his lead vehicle, killing his lieutenant instantly and wounding 2 others. Without hesitation, Hayes had rushed forward, dragging the wounded men to safety while his unit laid down covering fire. He had almost made it back to the relative safety of the second vehicle when the second blast went off. The doctors in the field hospital had been amazed that he had survived it all. Shattered femur, destroyed knee, massive internal bleeding. The list of injuries read like a medical textbook. But Hayes had been conscious through most of it, his mind crystal clear even as his body screamed in agony. He kept asking about his men, kept trying to give orders, kept insisting that he needed to get back to the fight. It had taken 3 doses of morphine and a direct order from his commanding officer to get him to lie still. The rehabilitation had been a different kind of war entirely. Months of physical therapy, countless hours of learning to walk again, the slow and painful process of accepting that his body would never be the same. But perhaps the hardest part had been the silence. After 30 years of military service, after decades of command, responsibility, and constant action, Hayes found himself adrift in a world that seemed to move too slowly and too quietly. It was his eldest son, Michael, who had suggested the walks. "Dad, you need a mission," he had said during one of their increasingly awkward visits, "something to give you purpose." And so Hayes had chosen Buckingham Palace, not just because it was within walking distance, but because it represented something larger than himself. Duty, service, the continuity of the institutions he had spent his life defending. Now, as he approached the halfway point of his journey, Hayes could feel the familiar burning in his legs, the signal that his body was approaching its limits. But he pushed forward, as he had every Sunday for the past 8 months. Driven by a determination that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with the promises he had made to the men who hadn't made it home. Miller, still standing at rigid attention, had been watching Hayes approach with growing concern. There was something different about the Veterans Gate today, something that suggested he was pushing himself harder than usual. Miller had learned to read people in his years of service, both in combat and in ceremony, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that Hayes was in trouble. The crowd of tourists had begun to thin slightly as the morning wore on, but those who remained seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding before them. They were focused on their cameras, their selfies, their quick glimpses of the famous guards who never moved, never spoke, never acknowledged their presence. They saw the pageantry and the tradition, but they missed the humanity beneath the uniform. Hayes' breathing had become more labored now. Each inhalation was a conscious effort. The pain in his legs was no longer a dull ache, but a sharp, insistent reminder of his limitations. Still, he pressed forward, his eyes fixed on the memorial ahead, his mind filled with the faces of the men he had lost. Thompson, barely 19, who had died in his arms after the first blast. Rodriguez, a father of 3 who had been planning to retire after this deployment. Jenkins, the comedian of the unit, whose last words had been a joke about the quality of the field hospital food. Miller's training had taught him to remain motionless regardless of circumstances, to maintain his post no matter what happened around him. But his experience in Afghanistan had taught him something else entirely: when to break the rules, when to act, when to choose humanity over protocol. As he watched Hayes struggle forward, something deep inside him recognized a kindred spirit, a fellow warrior who refused to surrender to his circumstances. The first sign of real trouble came when Hayes' left leg began to tremble. It started as a barely perceptible shake, but Miller's trained eye caught it immediately. Hayes was fighting it, trying to maintain his composure, but the tremor was spreading, and Miller could see the sweat beading on the veteran's forehead despite the cool morning air. Hayes himself was acutely aware of what was happening. He had felt this before during his worst days in rehabilitation, when his body would simply refuse to cooperate, no matter how hard he willed it to move. The doctors had explained it to him. Nerve damage, muscle fatigue, the inevitable consequence of the trauma his body had endured. But knowing the medical reasons didn't make it any easier to accept, and it certainly didn't make it any less humiliating when it happened in public. The tourists were beginning to notice now. A few cameras turned in Hayes' direction, more out of curiosity than concern. An elderly woman whispered something to her companion. Pointing discreetly at the struggling veteran, a young man with a backpack paused his conversation to watch, his expression shifting from mild interest to genuine worry. Miller's internal conflict was reaching a breaking point. Every fiber of his military training screamed at him to maintain his position, to trust in the system, to let others handle the situation. But his combat experience whispered something different. That sometimes the greatest act of courage was knowing when to break the rules, when to choose immediate action over proper procedure. Hayes had made it another 20 yards when his right leg buckled completely. For a moment, he managed to catch himself, his cane taking the full weight of his body as he fought to regain his balance. The crowd gasped collectively, a sound that seemed to echo off the palace walls. Several people stepped forward, but no one quite knew what to do, how to help, or whether their assistance would be welcome or seen as pity. It was in that moment of collective uncertainty that Hayes's cane slipped on the smooth stone, and gravity finally claimed its victory. He fell forward, his body unable to compensate, his hands reaching out instinctively to break his fall. Time seemed to slow as he pitched toward the unforgiving pavement. His metals caught the light one last time before Miller moved. The decision was instantaneous, born not from conscious thought, but from something deeper. The same instinct that had made him cover a wounded comrade under fire. The same reflex that had driven him to charge an enemy position to save his unit. In one fluid motion, he broke formation, stepped forward, and caught Hayes before he could hit the ground. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. Cameras flashed. Someone shouted, but Miller heard none of it. His entire focus was on the man in his arms. This stranger who was somehow not a stranger at all, this veteran whose struggle he recognized as his own. "Steady, sir," Miller said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced far worse crises than this. "I've got you." Hayes looked up into Miller's face, and for a moment, the years fell away. He saw not a young guardsman, but a fellow soldier, someone who understood the weight of duty and the cost of service. The pride that had driven him to make this journey. Every Sunday, the same pride that had made him hesitate to accept help suddenly seemed less important than the simple human connection he saw in the younger man's eyes. "Thank you," Corporal Hayes managed, his voice filled with emotion and exhaustion. Miller helped Hayes to a nearby bench, his movements careful and respectful. The tourists maintained a respectful distance, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, something that went beyond the usual pageantry of the palace. A few continued to film, but most simply watched in silence, recognizing that this moment deserved their attention rather than their cameras. As they sat together on the bench, Miller felt the weight of what he had just done. He had broken protocol, abandoned his post, violated the most basic rules of his assignment. But looking at Hayes, seeing the gratitude and recognition in the older man's eyes, he knew he had made the right choice. Some things were more important than regulations, more sacred than procedure. "Afghanistan?" Miller asked quietly, the question carrying layers of meaning that only another veteran would understand. Hayes nodded slowly, his hand unconsciously moving to his damaged leg. "Helmand, 09, IED, took my lieutenant, tried to drag him clear. The second blast, well, you can guess the rest." Miller's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "I was there, 12 Queen's Company. We heard about your patrol, what you did for your men." The recognition hit Hayes like a physical blow. This young man, this guardian of ceremony and tradition, had been part of the same conflict, had walked the same dust-choked roads, had faced the same enemy. They were connected not just by uniform and service, but by shared experience, by the invisible bonds that linked all who had served in that distant, dangerous place. The silence that followed was comfortable, the kind that existed between men who had been tested in the crucible of war and emerged, changed.